Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fourth and final webinar in this inclusive reporting series. Firstly, I would like, in the spirit of reconciliation, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are all joining and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people and to those in the audience with us tonight. I have the great privilege to be your MC this evening. My name is Anthea Hancock, and I'm the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation and the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. And I would also like to recognise our partners in this initiative, Media Diversity Australia and the Walkley Foundation. We've been delighted to work with these excellent organisations in this series and hope that for those of you who have attended the previous sessions, that you found them enjoyable and of value. This evening, we'll be discussing diversity and ethics. Many of you will recall that we have talked earlier in this series about the language of storytelling, engaging with communities, and expanding audiences. All of these have emphasised the importance of understanding communities, of encouraging journalists and the media to expand their networks, and to be sensitive to the multitude of cultural nuances and experiences that may impact the levels of trust that may be lacking when individuals are approached for insights, comments, or responses. All of these, though, sit in a broader ethical context. That is why we have invited three excellent speakers to provide us with their views on how Australian media is faring in their engagement with a diverse society and where there may be some ethical dimensions to consider. Firstly, I would like to introduce Hass Dellal. Hass is the Executive Director of the Australian Multicultural Foundation since 1989, where he's worked tirelessly for minority communities and is now constantly sought out to advise all levels of government, academia and communities. Until relatively recently, Hass was the chair of SBS, having served 10 years on that board, as well as being the deputy chair of the Australian Multicultural Council. He's also served as special advisor to the Australasian Police Multicultural Advisory Bureau, and he serves as a director on the board of the Scanlon Foundation. I would next like to introduce you to Russell Anderson. Russell is the Executive Officer of the National Ethnic and Multicultural Broadcasters Council. He has a career that includes extensive experience over 21 years in various media roles. He has worked as a journalist in media production and management, as a trainer and as senior media advisor for East Timor's national radio and television station. He's also worked for the United Nations, UNICEF, UNDP, AusAid, and for national and international NGOs and local government. And he also has significant experience in communities broadcasting sector and ethnic community media. And finally, I'm also very pleased to welcome our third guest, Juan Paolo Legaspi. Juan Paolo is the Vice President of the National Ethnic and Multicultural Broadcasters Council. He works with community groups, government and non-government organisations to promote multiculturalism in the Australian media landscape. Juan Paolo has been a broadcaster for the local Filipino community in South Australia since 2008 via local media multicultural community radio station 5EBI. This is a natural extension of his commitment to community advocacy, policy development, strategic planning, and communications both within the government and non-government sectors. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
In a similar fashion to our previous webinars, this session will be a free-ranging discussion, followed by Q&A from all of you, and we hope to be able to address all of your questions, or at least as many as we can get to in that time. Please feel free to send them through to the chat anytime. So I would like to start by asking all our guests, and starting with Hass, what's the good news, Hass? Has there been progress in the relationships between communities and the mainstream media? And if so, why do you think this has occurred?
Thanks, Anthea. And I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on and pay my respects to elders past and present. And thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. Look, if I can start by saying the issue of diversity in the newsroom, or having a genuine and equal relationship with multicultural communities, has really been a constant source of discussion for some time now. And really at the heart of the issue, and what remains an issue, is that it's an unresolved contradiction. is that, Australia is a multicultural society. That is a reality. But in the media, the media in the main tells a very different story. Now, having said that, I think there is some good news too. We've come a long way since those days when someone had told me that the only diversity you'll find in our media organisation is in the cleaning department. And I hazard a guess that the department was probably the most informed, up to date on community issues at the time. But we have moved along, and I think there's a greater awareness of the importance of engaging with diverse communities today in a meaningful way, and to achieve that diversity of thought and relevance. And I think we've had some really good work being done the last few years, particularly with the PricewaterhouseCoopers report on media and employment and diverse workforce, but recently with the Media Diversity Australia report, Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories? I think that's raised the level of consciousness and awareness about, what media organisations are missing out on, and why it's so important now to be as diverse as possible, whether within your workforce, because that diversity actually connects you with the communities and will make you successful one way or the other. So I think there is that level of will, and I think it is slowly, the landscape is changing, and it does need to change, particularly over the last 2 years, what we've gone through with this recent event of the pandemic, because it's changed in so many ways that, there are new powerful voices, there are new stories, new issues, challenges, new connections, exciting and new narratives and stories out there, new leaderships and new communities, and you really don't want to miss out.
Thanks very much, Hass. I think there's some really interesting stories to be told about changes that are happening in the media. But Russell, from your perspective, what do you think? Do you think there's been progress in these relationships between community and the mainstream media?
I think there has been really good progress. I think there's much more awareness. There's much more active voices now looking at the mainstream media and making them aware of that. And I think we have to realise in Australia, we have a diverse media anyway. We do have, the mainstream media, the commercial media, we have public broadcasters, and we have community media, and it's very diverse. And I think because of that diversity in our media, there's a lot of opportunities as well for those people to move up and to be part of the mainstream media. And we've got those active voices happening now with inside the commercial media saying we need more diversity. And I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call for mainstream media. They realise that if they're not telling the stories of the people that are their audience, then they're not going to listen to them anymore. They can turn off. They can go to social media. They've got so many different ways of getting news and information now. So I think it's a bit of a commercial interest to make sure you're telling that story of the people that you're broadcasting to or writing to. And I think we've got this change globally. You've got the Me Too movement, you've got Black Lives Matters, which are pushing forward these, more pressure on people to be responsible, be accountable. And then you've got, Donald Trump being elected. And now we're actually looking, what is the truth? That's the big question. People have to talk about facts and alternative facts. And now the media is really in the spotlight about, are they telling the stories that we need to be hearing? So you've got a lot of global changes, got a local changes, but I think you've also got journalists which are trying to really, find the right people to be telling those stories as well.
Thank you, Russell. Juan, Paolo, I'm interested in your thoughts from the local community perspective. Do you think people are seeing a difference, a progress in this relationship?
I think so, Anthea, and not to repeat everyone's comments, but I entirely agree with them. There's an emerging meta conversation about news and information, and especially from my local community, but from broader communities within my state and nationally, there's a growing conversation about sources, information. I couldn't imagine a society where we actually discuss the post-truth movement or disinformation. I think they're very healthy conversations to have. But with that comes an opportunity about reassessing the way that we do things. It's not business as usual, and one would hope that things change immediately and over time as a reform. Yeah. So I guess that's the silver lining that I could take, that there's a deeper level of conversation about news, media, and information more broadly.
And isn't it's really refreshing. Now, this session is about ethics in particular. While I've got you there, Juan, Paolo, how would I'd like to hear a little bit from each of the panelists, but starting with you. on how should those in the media approach understanding ethical nuances that might be specific to individual communities. If you've got any examples, that'd be really useful too.
Sure. I guess it's an opportunity to reassess it from the ground up. So it's not only just on the reportage of perspectives, but how it's gained and the whole production chain could be completely reassessed. And there's the advantage of talking about diversity of perspectives. So as a case example, the most obvious one is pandemic response, and how government communications and various outlets have reassessed how they've communicated that and really thought about, by domain, talking to various communities that would not normally be considered as part of that communication channel. That's just one small case example, but I think there's not only a demand for it, there's a necessity to create a more broader perspective of different diverse perspectives.
And to know how to get deeper into communities, I think.
That's right.
Russell, what about you? Have you, Hass, have you?
Well, no, I was just going to build, I was just going to build on Juan's, and I think the first thing is to, and what the pandemic has really demonstrated is to really get to know your community. Firstly, understand the history of your community and who they are and what they are. And it's really not one size fits all. And I think the way you approach, the way you craft your messaging is going to be very diverse. And in order to do that, you really need to understand those nuances in terms of working with your communities. Make sure that the collaboration is mutually beneficial, not a fixed relationship. Examine the relationship of reporters to their community perceptions about media outlet and distrust of media, particularly if you're going to give valuable information. Do I trust this piece of information? Do they understand me? Beware of when your own sort of knee-jerk biases that may occur. Also, review how you might want to approach or question or rethink whether those questions you set, do they have those underlying biases or values and structures that might be causing people to think one way but answer another. So I think
that's such an interesting point, Hass, and I'm wondering whether or not those that don't come from those particular communities, how can they force themselves to think, to question the questions they're thinking about asking? Should they actually share them with people and get that feedback, or how do they go through that process? Well,
I think this comes back to your first point about connections and relationship with communities. And of course, any media organisation that has a diverse workforce obviously readily makes those connections. But even so, I think it's even if, it's making sure you have those genuine connections within the communities. And it's not that one source, there are so many diverse voices within communities. One thing that we've learned through this pandemic, and even an absolute surprise to me after 45 years in this field, is the layers of communities that exist. Communities that we've never been able to reach or talk to before have suddenly had to come out because we've had to craft important health messages so that everybody gets those messages. So you've really had to work very hard to break those layers down. And it's not one community. We found layers within communities of the same community that all have different ways of communicating. And it's become quite complex, even for ethnic media, ethnic communities, let alone mainstream. So I think it's a really important message, the way we reconnect with communities. And I think there's been some very interesting lessons learned. Even for government, the way they've been crafting their health messages, they've had to come back to communities to actually help develop and construct messages that could reach these more vulnerable communities that weren't getting the messages. Because, it's all good and well to say we're all in this together, but are we really all in this together?
And that's a really interesting point. And Russell, I was thinking too that when it comes to understanding different communities, you work with quite a lot of channels into those different communities, people who are speaking from that particular viewpoint, with all of the different channels that are associated with your particular association. Is there an opportunity there to better understand those communities by the mainstream media actually working more closely with those particular channels that that sit within your council to understand those ethical nuances, if you like, or how they should approach to understand those layers that Hass was talking about?
Yeah, it's something we've been working on for some time now about building employment pathways. For 6 years ago now, we've held a conference about making these connections and working with Media Diversity Australia. We are making those connections. Just this month, we're working with Channel 10 television with their nightly news to have Arabic, Vietnamese and Mandarin translations and audio up on the social media networks. So there's these connections and links being made. So that's part of that good news, that those links are there. And that feeds back into the relationship. So those people that are working with Channel 10 will build that relationship with that station, which they haven't had before on that level. So that's sort of one example. And there's hopefully that growing opportunity that we can create those employment pathways. We've certainly had people from even the NNBC and people that are working with us in our membership base that are starting to get jobs in the mainstream media, in the ABC and public broadcaster as well. So I think there's in the hopefully near future, but we're talking 5, maybe 10 years, that takes that time to change things, that we could see those things start to happen. But I think the ethical nuances are very difficult to deal with. I think one of the big things, one for me that stands out is to do no harm, and I think that's something that when you're doing reporting, I think is a really important thing to think of, do no harm. And it's very difficult in a news-driven cycle, if you're doing news, to actually, you've got to churn something out, you've got to put it out really quickly. So I almost think there needs to be a bigger level of change, not just media representation with people in the media understanding how to do that reporting, but it needs to be changes within management, programming, and the media institutions. The mainstream media commercial institutions need to change that as well, in a sense that they need to be able to think of a deeper narrative, storytelling and conversations around how they present things. So I think that sort of change will then slow us down and get us to understand the discussions and be able to produce better ethical reporting.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Hass, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, I guess it's to be need to be sort of transparent about all reporting choices, including the use of specific terminology, ethical decisions, and sourcing choices. I think it plays all into that.
Absolutely. I'm interested to know whether or not, because we've got all of those that are part of the Ethnic Broadcasters Council that Russell is communicating with. We've got multiple channels that SBS communicates to various different communities. I mean, there's quite an extensive number now, not to mention what happens on social media. But I'm interested to know how should the media landscape look within Australia? Is it possible to expect too much from mainstream media that might be covered by other areas, or is it actually really important that we bring these voices together across all of those different channels that we've got available to us? Can we accommodate them? I'll go to Juan Paolo first, because Juan Paolo, you had this experience of working with the Philippine community radio. What do you feel is its role in the broader media landscape, and particularly for the community it's communicating with?
Well, the role has changed because we've been in existence as an entity for more than 40 years. And that changed from its original mission, which was to share information from the Philippines into the local Adelaide community, in my example. But I've noticed a seismic shift in the role, where it's become very hyper-local about what's going on in your local geography within the context of me being a Filipino-Australian, a big shift overall. And I think that can be built upon not only for community media, but for media at large, about taking that as a bridge for your local communities outwards. So if I looked at it from two perspectives, an internal perspective, so within your local area, you're sharing local stories from a different perspective. And then from an external perspective, if I was asked what it looks like from the outside, I'd want to see more diversity in channels of media. We would think in the commercial aspect, if it followed pure market forces, diversity will happen, but there's something that needs to change to allow that to happen. But there's all these subsections of different media outlets. And I think with that diversity increasing internally, that will happen as a result as well externally.
I think that's a really important point. And in actual fact, one of the questions on the chat at the moment is really talking about whether or not, because when we're discussing the pandemic, it's been pretty much about how to get information from the top down effectively, if the government is the top down. But Anthony's particularly interested in getting the ideas and thoughts out from the communities up and out into the broader community itself. Is that, Juan Paolo, is that something that is part of that role now that sits with these local community radio stations?
Absolutely. Customer comes first, right? And those stories build and generate more momentum. And once you start at the local level, it will build in. And I'm hoping there'll be more pathways so that kind of reporting builds into more commercial entities as well. It will happen, but it needs to come from the ground up, 100%.
So Hass, from your perspective, it's not necessarily just getting the word out that people are speaking, but actually informing strategy or policy or service delivery. Are you seeing that from the work that SBS has done or from the community's voices themselves?
No, I certainly have. I think, you know, I mean, with SBS, I mean, it started off as humble beginnings as initially to put out messages around Medibank, it's health services. So, you know, that inevitably it becomes a service delivery because you have to engage with communities and understand communities. And I think what SBS's success has been over the 45 years is it's continued that community connections with delivering particular services around settlement, immigration, language services, a whole range of services. But then it's evolved out and has now become a mainstream provider for all Australians in terms of a whole range of issues. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at how media can become, you know, from providing a service for a particular community, then encompassing an entire community and being inclusive and really demonstrating what we are as a society. I think one of the areas that really needs to be explored is how mainstream media connects with ethnic media, print media, and not just radio. You know, ethnic media has sort of often been thought as some sort of a quaint service for nostalgic migrants and encouraging segregation and just reporting on home issues and so forth. That nothing can be, you know, from the truth. In terms of ethnic media, connects migrants and in a whole range of ways to a sense of participation, a sense of belonging and being part of a society by informing them of what is happening in Australia with part of their settlement. So, but also I think one of the other things that we don't realise within ethnic media, it's grown so much. There are just so many voices. There's so much activity within ethnic media, and there is so much strength in those stories and so much currency. I mean, just in Victoria alone, there are monthly 1.5 million readers of ethnic media, just in Victoria alone. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, how do you actually capitalise and use that as a source to engage, you know, with those connections with mainstream media in terms of, you know, sharing stories, sort of, I guess, in a way, ensuring that there are benefits of both mainstream media and with ethnic media. They can expand their brand in new demographics, increase access to sourcing better reports about specific communities, opening up new markets, but also a source for young, talented journalists to come from, to go into mainstream media. So, you know, developing those really strategic and practical partnerships and not work separately, because they are a serious voice.
Absolutely. Now, Russell, there's been a question in the chat to do with these the mergers of the big media monopolies, if you like, the Fairfax and the Nine and all of those. How do you feel, especially, I mean, it's really interesting, that example that you gave about working with Channel 10. What is this, how do we deal with this relationship between community voices, and we have lots of community voices, as Hass just said. How do we deal with that going up against these great monoliths of the mainstream media?
Look, I think in the past there hasn't been that connection. There hasn't been much of that at all. And like Hass said, I think the commercial media has said, okay, well, there's a public broadcaster and there's SBS, and that we don't need to talk to them because they've got their own media. But I think there can be a lot more crossover. It's something we're working on. Through Media Diversity Australia, we have networking drinks where we get together with mainstream media, public broadcaster. We're holding in a month's time a China forum about Chinese diaspora and how the media reports on them. And that's driven by Media Diversity Australia and us to organise mainstream media people that were reporting on China and community broadcasters coming together in a panel. So I think it's a lot of those networking and those connections that need to happen over a period of time before we can have that really strong input into those
individual connections, Russell. These bringing individual journalists together,
groups,
and freelance journalists into this mix.
Yes, I think that relationship building is part of that thing, because a lot of the people that in ethnic groups don't want to talk to the media. They don't trust them. They don't trust they'll be able to tell their story. So that relationship is the really important thing. And like I said, we can build that relationship with journalists, but it's the management of these commercial stations that need to start to hear the story as well. And I think they will. It's a commercial driven thing that they need to be talking to those audiences, because they will switch off and go other places. So I think there's lots of sort of angles coming into how this could speed up. I mean, in the last 5 years, we've seen some speeding up, like with the reports that Hass has mentioned, and there's pressure in other countries around this as well. So if we can do that networking, build that relationship around those issues, we can eventually have that input and connection around that.
Great.
And also, Anthea, I mean, there are some great benchmarks there with SBS and ABC. The way they've had to work with communities. I mean, 45 years of experience in terms of building networks, community consultations, speaking with communities, setting up community advisory councils, keeping in touch with the changing environment, diverse workforce, those one-to-one connections. A multicultural Australia is an evolving Australia. And therefore, everything we do, whether it's in our media or government services, we need to evolve with that. And that's only going to happen with these broader connections and being in touch with your community. And that's one lesson that SBS has learned. Yes, a public broadcaster, but it's something that, and the same with ABC, it is something that, we've had to learn simply through these connections to be relevant. And it's really good journalism. It's about providing a point of view. It's about providing opinions for people to have opinions. So I think it's providing information.
And demonstrating there's an audience.
Well,
it's not going to be confronting to the audience. They're actually really interested.
Absolutely. And again, I re-emphasize, I mean, connections with ethnic media, whether they be radio or print, it's so vital, because they have become sophisticated sources of communication where communities go to for reliable information.
Absolutely. Can I move on now to social media? Because we know that this has brought the world into everybody's homes. For many, it's also been the way to stay connected to their home country and to its news services. So I'm curious as to how perhaps an organisation such as SBS has gone about building trust and a constituency with these small communities, but also from Russell and Juan Paolo, how is the NEMBC connected into its audiences, and how do you see that evolving in the future with this impact or inflow, if you like, of information coming from outside Australia and informing people in a somewhat different fashion to the way it might have been done had they got it directly from an Australian broadcaster. So perhaps first to Juan Paolo, what's your thinking about how this connection to audiences in the world of social media works?
Twofold, I guess. So if I took a page out of the Scanlon social cohesion report, the trust into social media has deteriorated as a result of the pandemic, I guess. And so it's not only social media usage, it's the trust into what information is being plugged into there. And I think that's where local voices, trained local voices as well, really play an impact there. And that's something that's been a focus of the NEMBC. The second one is the audience who's listening. and it's expanded, from radio, local radio, where you're challenged by your frequency, you have a global impact now. And that's been an interesting journey. Russell knows more of the details, but I was always fascinated by this case study of a Macedonian broadcaster in the Hunter Valley that gets hundreds of thousands of listeners every week globally. And her stories are local, but it's got a global audience. And I find that fascinating. People thought I was a little bit original when I thought community media can fit in our Department of Foreign Affairs white paper on soft power. But I truly believe it. We can really demonstrate the power of Australian multiculturalism globally through these new platforms.
That's such an interesting thing, Russell, this sense of not only that information is coming in through social media from outside, but also that we may well be generating information out into these other communities outside of Australia's borders. Is that something that you're seeing much of?
Oh, it's a massive change. So the Macedonian program that Juan spoke about was in Wollongong, and they have, I think, 16,000 Macedonians in Wollongong. So previously, it's a local radio station for Wollongong, and so that's her audience. But now she can stream it, put it on demand, put it on Facebook, and so she can capture people in the state, people in the country, people back home, and the diaspora. So she gets thousands of people listening to her program now, way beyond the reach of Wollongong, and a lot of programs are doing that now. So they're getting feedback, they're chatting with people in other countries and connecting to them. So what was a local radio program just in one little area is now global and connecting globally like that. And so it opens up a lot more information, possibilities, business connections, a whole range of things could be happening around that.
It also helps to make this feeling that in actual fact, you're not so distant from your home country, that in actual fact, you can be a part of a global society just by living in Australia. You're not that distant.
Yeah, and we have
That's
a
right.
multilingual news service that we started doing for when COVID hit. We started producing a daily multilingual news service, and our Maltese presenter is not such a good translator, but he's got a friend in Malta in a community radio station. So our script that we write in the morning goes to Malta to be translated and back again for him to produce, to do the news in Victoria. So yeah, that's the reach that we have. Like it can reach, particularly because of that diaspora home. There's a lot more networking and connection that can go on.
Isn't that terrific? Because in some people's minds, there's this sense that is a threat, if you like, but in actual fact, it's not. It's another value add that comes to us through the media. So
yeah, really absolutely. Terrific. Yeah, absolutely, a positive value add, and I think we've seen the similar thing with the in-language services through SBS, not only within Australia, but how that has also reached globally as well, and those connections. But also, I think it's also created an opportunity for broadcasters like SBS and others to work with their communities to build their social media skills and sets as well, because they've developed their own sets of platforms which they communicate amongst each other and internationally as well. And it's been just a fascinating, mosaic of diaspora communication, which is absolutely terrific, because it gives us an opportunity to talk about us as a society and the issues that we're dealing with and challenges with other societies, and some of the similarities and commonalities around some of these things around values and issues. And I think it's been a learning lesson for everyone, but also a great opportunity to really talk about the strength of diversity and the strength of those voices and the power of diverse voices. And I think that's been a plus. That's one of the things that we can really say about this pandemic, the way communities have come together to help each other.
Absolutely, but also to potentially inform other countries about advice and recommendations about what needs to be done. So finally, before I go to the questions that are coming in through the chat, I just would like to hear from each one of you your final words of advice for the audience when it comes to engaging with communities. How can they be ethical in their activities, and what do you see as the possible pitfalls that they need to avoid, and how will they know when they're on the right track? So perhaps I might start with Juan Paolo. What do you think? What are your final words of advice?
Well, it starts with that first principle of empathy, I guess. empathy and trust. And when engaging with different communities, it's just going in there with an open perspective, and don't go in with a purely transactional perspective either. The results and the benefits will flow on as a result, but I guess start off with that. And that challenge of increasing diversity, I think whilst it is a challenge, it is an inevitability. I'm a big fan of SBS Pop Asia, for example, which I highly credit to the popularity of BTS. Can you imagine a world without Squid Game? I think we've seen changes in film in Hollywood. For some reason, news is one of the last pieces of the puzzle. It will happen, I think, but it needs to come from that place of trust, not transactional arrangement.
Thank you very much, Juan Paolo. Russell, what do you think? What are some final words of advice you have to our journalistic audience?
Look, there are lots of really good codes and ethics to work by that each of the different sectors will have, and the community broadcasting sector has a code as well. It's always good to refer to that code, but I think it really comes down to communicating in the newsroom, talking to your colleagues around what it is, because it can vary. It's very nuanced, covering a particular story, covering a particular issue. So it's really good to have that discussion. And I think a lot of the codes of ethics don't have this principle of do no harm as a concept. Now, ultimately, I'm not talking about investigative journalism where you do want to do harm to somebody because they're corrupt, but just general reporting, I think as a concept is do no harm in the back of your mind, then I think that's a good general concept to go in with.
Right. And Hass, what about you? Some final
agree with all of that. But look, if I can just say that diversity is a really complex concept, and to maximize its benefits, we must sort of make a conscious effort to understand what that really entails. And whilst many of us will agree that diversity enriches our lives and broadens our attitudes, it also pushes each and every one of us to accept a different reality from our own. And in fact, diversity is just that difference, that variation, that variedness, and the nature of that variedness and how it can be changeful. And it's really important that we understand that difference, and that's the challenge, and how we actually portray that difference and that variedness and portray in how media portrays that and capitalizes on that diversity. And the way you really need to understand that as well as to build varied networks and make sure you include diverse voices and participate in discussion on social media and on Facebook with communities. Be part of it. Be part of the conversation with them to build that trust and to really get those nuances. That's how you will learn.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hass. So now we might just punch through these questions that have come in. The first one is, what do you think about having an audience relations team? So Russell, does that resonate with you? Do you know what that might be?
I don't know what that exactly means, but I know that within community broadcasting, you do get audience connection because and I go to radio and broadcasting a lot, but it probably happens within print media as well. The people that broadcast on a community radio station are known in their community. There are many celebrities that have been doing it for tens of years, and they go out into their community, they connect with their community, and their community give them feedback on their programs. They're responsible to their community, so they feel that responsibility. So that's a really audience feedback loop that happens within community, and I think that's happening in a much more adversarial sort of way within commercial and mainstream media, because you've now got people that can respond to mainstream media through social media by responding to them aggressively if they don't like something. That's another way of an audience feedback loop to mainstream media. And that's a good thing in a way. It's holding them more accountable. But certainly if it was done in a more community-minded way where that could be less aggressive and less connected, and changes from mainstream media to be more responsible to those communities would be better, and finding ways that the audience could feed that information back in is really good. We have ACMA, Australian Communications Media Association, the Press Council, that receive complaints and they respond to media, but that's a slow process. The quicker process is if it was audience-based and responding much more quicker, like is happening.
Yeah.
Can Can I just add to that? I think that's a great suggestion, and that's something that when I was with SBS and with SBS now, that is practice where we have audience engagement and consultation several times of the year, right throughout the state, where we call in the audience to sit down with board, management, and producers and directors to talk about the issues and the challenges and feedback. And I think it plays very well. I think it's a great suggestion. It really connects you with the community and you hear those real voices.
Oh, great, thank you. Juan, Paolo, I think the next one might be for you, which is really that mainstream media gets support from government, from corporates, from businesses, but ethnic media has somewhat more difficulty actually finding those resources and being able to channel them. How has your radio station managed to find the funding to keep going? And do you have any advice for other smaller ethnic media about how they might be able to get resources going in their direction?
That is quite literally the $1 million question, isn't it? You hang on for dear life. That's my advice. I guess with the changing nature of the business, we've noticed that there's been international interest in supporting our station, for example. Now that comes with the risks as well, but I guess that's the advantage of having a global audience. One case example was a Filipino freight forwarding company wanted to have a conversation with us about doing a campaign, risks and benefits. So I guess it's that with the new model, there's new opportunities, but just be careful as well. But the future really, federal and state government funding is always welcome, but that should always just be seen as like a foundational piece. It shouldn't be seen as the only method. I know that's easy to say for some stations like mine, but it's always the aspiration, because without that sense of self-sustainability, it's not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think this might be a question for everybody, because it's really asking, what do the panelists think of the top-down structure of many public and private broadcasters, whereas the community radios operate in a probably more lateral fashion, more like a cooperative coming together, and yet you've got these mainstream broadcasters which are very top-down, very hierarchical. Is it possible to come up with some sort of a national scheme to encourage firm diversity through democratic or more lateralized structures? What's your thinking there? Hass, you've probably got more of that perspective from a mainstream media.
Yeah, and I'll leave it to Russell.
Well, I suppose, I mean, that's a sort of long-term structural change that, you know, we'd be looking at, but I mean, that's, you know, that's out of our hands really, in a way, what those mainstream sort of stations do. You know, what the mainstream media does with that, I mean, they're commercially driven, they've set these structures up, they're much more to deal with the commercial environment. But as they, like, if more people start to go into media, mainstream media, and start to work with those people, then that discussion, that narrative might start to change that management programming system of how things are decided. I think it'll always be hierarchical, but at least flatten the curve a bit or something. But, you know, I mean, certainly community radio is very grassroots. You know, the people that sit on the boards are broadcasters themselves. Even our organisation, everyone is on our board as a broadcaster. So that's very flat.
Lots of group decision making and group contribution.
But you don't want to lose that grassroots impetus. And I think the challenge is, how do you get that grassroots model funded and supported, and how is it sustained? Because it brings a great sense of there's a sense of purity and reality to it, because it is it's so close to the grassroots. And I think it's a win-win for either, you know, those funded broadcasters, the commercial broadcasters, as well as the grassroots broadcasters. I think we just need to bridge that gap. There's got to be a real genuine effort to understand that, and not look at public broadcasting or community broadcasting as sort of second-rate tier news. It's not the case at all. And I think it has changed. It's become much more complex and sophisticated in lots of ways. Just because people volunteer their times, it doesn't mean they're not professional.
Yes, there is one other question, which is how can we join the community to mainstream media? And I think we've actually touched on it in a number of different answers. but it does highlight this, what you were just saying, Hass, this opportunity that Australia has to actually have a very multiplicitous media landscape, if you like, that it doesn't have to be that everything that mainstream media has to solve every problem, or community media has to move in a particular direction. It's actually that we can create an environment for Australia that actually responds to a lot of diverse needs that come from different communities and different people. What you don't want to do is to alienate anybody away from any of them. So these perceptions are important.
That's right. And if there's an economic argument to that, as I said earlier, I mean, if you look at just the stats in Victoria, 1.5 million people reading ethnic media. And for a long time, we've had to work with commercial media and broadcasters about trying to tap into these markets because of advertising. So it's just purely from an economic perspective for advertising to sell their products and brands to communities because they, it is a good market. It's now suddenly they've realized, oh my God, there's such a huge audience out there. And now we're starting to see so many shifts and changes in terms of the way brands are being produced or marketed on particular mainstream, commercial television and broadcasters. But there's still a lot more out there. And if you work with ethnic media, whether it be print or broadcasting, there are some great economic values which will lead to other social values.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just before I ask whether any of you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share, I just might mention that there's a comment from Jelena in there, which is really a statement more than a question, but it's really saying shared engagement, and she's referring to Indigenous people, but it needs to be embedded with respect, trust, reciprocity, and mutual relationship. And I think that probably applies to all the groups that we're talking about this evening. So thank you, Jelena, for that. Has anybody got any final thoughts that they would like to share? Because we've got to the end of the questions. So any comments before we finish up?
Well, if I could just add, thank you for this opportunity, first of all. But I guess in terms of connecting community media with mainstream media on that particular topic, I guess when we talk about diversity, we're not seeking a complete reshaping of the dynamics. I was just speaking with Russell the other day. I still think about the connections between community media and commercial media in the lens of some of my favorites. Sean McAuliffe, for example, how he came from community media all the way up. And that pathway still exists. It just needs to be expanded on and nudged in the right direction a little bit, but then the results will happen. I think that you'll see an explosion of diverse actors in all forms of news information, whether it's the reporting or the production side of things.
So Juan, Paolo, just one final thought coming in as I'm finishing up, but it's really suggesting that if a young person from a different cultural background is really passionate about media and storytelling, and they happen to be in community media, how do they bridge the gap and move into more mainstream media? Are there channels today, or is it networking? Is it just who you know that enables you to get that next opportunity into something bigger and better than what you might be seeking for your career?
Your first option is always to become undeniable, become so popular that no one can ever refuse you. The second step is, I guess, the networking. There are programs such as our work with MDA, and the public broadcasters have really stepped into the fore with this regard too. So it's changing, yes, but I think for the here and now, you need a blend, undeniable with that emerging trend. And hopefully the system becomes a little bit more accommodating and understanding, but those are your two options at the moment, I think.
And I also, just to add to that, I mean, there is some excellent programs now being produced through the Jan Nielsen, I think, Institute, where they're out there looking at running a whole range of training and seminars for people from diverse communities to come into work in terms of understanding how to get into mainstream media, working with journalists and working with television and mainstream broadcasting institutions as well. And I think there's more and more of these sorts of activities happening. There's there's a lot more engagement, and I think a lot of media and broadcasting agencies are starting to realise that there is an untapped source of wealth and talent out there, young talent from diverse communities, and there's what they're wanting to reach out and train these people. And I think the journalism schools are getting better at that. And I think there's I think some really positive things happening out there.
And I think it's worth mentioning that Media Diversity Australia just announced a fellowship for an 8-week scholarship program to actually participate in the lead up to the election, which would be really exciting. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. So Russell, any last thoughts?
Oh, just the last thoughts. I think it's really a challenging time for media because of the challenges of digital disruption, particularly with TV and newspaper sales and how that's changing. But I think it's a really exciting time because of digital, because of social media, and journalists can have lots of opportunities to be involved. And that changing sort of tide that's happening around questioning media and what we're doing with media. So hopefully a lot of the things we've spoken about today around the ethics and how that can become better and change, and how we can get better media representation and change those structures of mainstream media so that they're more community connected. I think there's a really exciting future in the next 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And just one final thing, I think it's really important for to provide sort of media training for CAL, cultural and linguistic diverse journalists, so that the storytellers and communities enable them to sort of have greater ownership and agency to tell their stories, and greater employment opportunities in the industry, and make sure that I think to hold more events to bring diverse or culturally diverse, linguistic diverse students together with media industry practitioners. To recruit more of them into the profession and provide those pathways into employment. And I think, and we're seeing some of that, but I think we need to do more of that.
And I think we should recognise the work of the Australian Multicultural Foundation in holding a series of those training programs for individuals that are interested in being more involved in the media and creating more voices to actually be able to be spokespeople for their communities. Or to get into that particular career of media and journalism. Yeah,
but also just establishing community spokespeople too. I mean, recently we ran a program with, we contracted several mainstream journalists, well-known journalists, to come and train a group of imams on how to work within the media and with journalists. So, people are open to all of this, and there's just so many opportunities for connections. And what that does for the journalists is also gets a real insight into that community and understands those nuances that we were talking about before. You just can't read it in a book. You've got to experience it. You've got to feel it. You've got to understand it, because it's ever changing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much to all our wonderful guests for their time and for sharing their extraordinary expertise with us. Recordings of all these sessions will be made available shortly through the Walkley Foundation website, so you can catch up on any that you've missed. I would like to thank the Walkley Foundation, in particular, Marcus Rao, for all their assistance in bringing these webinars to life. And finally, thank you to everyone in the audience for your time and interest in appreciating that there is still more progress to be made in reporting on our diverse Australia. Good evening, everybody, and thank you.